Hello, Bootstrappers.
Hello, bootstrappers.
And hello, bootstrappers.
Hi, today we have with us Rebecca Homkes. We've been friends for it's probably 4 or 5 years at this point. She was an advisor, is an advisor with our early stage startup fund, SVGS. She's also an instructor at the London School of Business and a pro at strategy and has helped companies all over the globe through YPO and other contacts on how to apply strategies. And we brought her in today to talk about something that she's been helping companies with during the pandemic to kind of back up and then figure out how to go forward with everything having changed so much. So, Rebecca, I'm going to turn over to you if you want to tell the audience a little bit about your background and how you got into helping companies with strategy.
Awesome. Very happy to. Hi, Will, and great to see you again. Yeah, so I'm based in London, England, and I actually teach at the London Business School, but in our corporate executive program, and spend most of my time working directly with CEOs and executive teams of fast scaling companies. So I specialize in high growth strategy, which is developing, executing, and innovating on strategy. And I actually work with companies in quite a few different journeys, so tens to hundreds of millions, hundreds to billion. But I also work with several companies who are in the several billion range. And what I discovered this year was what actually ended up happening is that first week of March, I was having conversation after conversation with CEOs who would tell me, look, Rebecca, like this just isn't fair. Like we had this great strategy. We were on a great pathway. Everything was working so well. And like now this crisis, like why me? Like why now? Like we had it all figured out. Things were so great. And it was after several of those that I almost just lost patience with it a bit, right? And you say, hey, look, if you want to wear the badge of an entrepreneur and call yourself a high growth CEO, you've got to be able to grow a company in any environment, right? Downturns, upturns, right? Everybody can grow a company when the market's great. It's the real people who come through in times like this. And I just started having several conversations, and from that formed this framework that I call Survive, Reset, Thrive, which has become a new mantra for many companies in that high growth space to really think about how to navigate a downturn. And it started with the notion of just stop trying to predict the future because like you can't, right? I can't, you can't, wish we could, but we can't. So if you can't predict the future, what can you do? And all you can really do is get great at making really good decisions, even when you can't make great predictions, which sounds simple, but that, Will and Eva, is probably how I'd summarize the big task right now. That you need to, as an executive team, get excellent and making great, robust decisions, even when you can't predict the future. But we don't see a lot of that, right? And I'm curious to see how many of these responses that you see is, when I watch CEOs kind of navigating through uncertainty, I see three very common responses in 2020 and really any downturn. The first one I call my March 2020 response. And this one, the CEO would say, look, Rebecca, I'm so sick of this new normal nonsense. I heard about this in 98, right? I heard about this in 2008. I've heard about this so many times in my career. There is never a new normal. Like, I've got this, right? And they just plow ahead doing the same thing they're doing. And then the second one I saw way too much. And here they would tell me, things are so uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know when we're going to be able to do this. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to wait until we know more. And the third thing is what I'm seeing a lot more now. And it's almost like people are panicking a bit because this is lasting a lot longer than they thought they would. So we're just like throwing stuff at the market to see what will stick. So I've labeled these delusion, paralysis, and chaos. And you can probably tell by the labels how great I think they're going to work.
Most entrepreneurs are optimists by nature, so they don't hit paralysis, but delusion and chaos definitely happen a lot.
I was going to say the people in your circle are probably a lot more in that first one. Just kind of, I got this. Like, it's no big deal. It's not any normal. Like, we're fine. And we keep plowing ahead.
Are you seeing, like, after this amount of time, are you seeing people start to migrate from the paralysis into the chaos now?
Yeah, exactly that, Eva. Is what I'm seeing is that it was really, I call it like early autumn, early fall, is where I saw a lot of that switch. Like, when the second lockdown started, especially here in Europe, when kind of second and third waves come in, it's like, oh shit, like this is not as fast as we thought it would be, right? And so like, let's just try to get something that works. But that doesn't really work either, right? But all of this said, like all jokes aside, I think it can be a great time to grow. It's just a hard time to grow. And you need to think about growth in a slightly different way. But punchline, when I found myself thinking about this, I just kind of come back to, but you can still grow a company right now, right? Downturns are still a great time to grow. It's just a harder time to grow. And I call it these three set phrases I call survive, reset, and thrive. You've got to stabilize the business, reset the strategy and plan, and then, be prepared to thrive on the other end of this. But punchline is that I just want to remind all the entrepreneurs I'm working with, downturns can be a great time to grow. It's empirically true, right, in previous downturns, and it's already proving out in this one as well. And the one thing I think is important emphasizing hasn't changed, and not trying to do a mini MBA in 30 seconds, but it's important to mention this, is that there's a little bit too much new normal, throw everything out the window talk. You know what's not changed is what strategy is, right? Strategy was, it is, it will always be about one thing. A growth strategy is about creating value. And all value creation is driving the biggest gap possible between your customer's willingness to pay and your total cost of getting it to them. So what you're trying to do in a strategy is drive those needles apart and keep them apart over time. I'm going to say it again. It was, it is, it will always be about that. The fundamental of strategy being value creation hasn't changed. If you can just keep that anchored in your mind as you make some of these decisions, I found that actually really helps. So what I wanted to mention, I want to go back to the punchline of survive, reset, thrive. Stabilize the business, reset the strategy and plan, and then thrive. Now, I've learned a lot about this framework too over the past 6 months. And one of the things that I've learned is that it's not a perfect checklist, right? Which I know isn't a great message for some of your bootstrap entrepreneurs who think they can kind of get done and move on, right? Is that there's a little bit of overlap across the 3 phases. Now, if anybody's part of a larger company, it's very possible that some business units or divisions are going to be in the survive phase longer than others, right? If you have a business that serves restaurants and a business that serves grocery stores, it's obviously grocery store business is going to be doing better. But any industry from chemical to aerospace to defense, you're going to see different business units hanging out longer. If you're a small company, right, you might find yourself actually going back to survive. And what I've really realized, guys, is it's actually okay. Just acknowledge what you are doing. Saying, look, there's another lockdown, there's this, we're back and stabilized for the next 3 or 4 weeks, and that's okay, as long as you call out where you are. Stabilize the business, reset, and get to thrive. A lot of guys in Silicon Valley have written the playbook on stabilize or survive, and I actually think the playbook is what I call the basics. And I found that companies that just went through the basics never got out, right? They were still stuck there. So let's go through the basics, and both of you invest in companies, so you probably help many put this playbook in. So what do? You shore up the balance sheet. You look at your cash flows, see if you get 18-month cash flow, hopefully, if not 9 months, if not minimum kind of 6 months on the books. You look at all your liabilities, see what you can renegotiate. You look at your receivables, see what you can get in, right? And it's just that checklist that we go through.
It's interesting because, the advice the VCs gave this time and the last couple of times is fire as many people as possible, right?
Yeah.
So that your runway stretches out.
Yeah.
And that just kind of seems to be the center. And that may be the right thing to do, but there's more to it.
Yeah, it can't be the knee jerk.
Yeah, it's knee jerk, right? And that, I'm so glad you said that, because this is the biggest thing that I saw, is if you can't call yourself a growth CEO or claim you have a growth mindset, which is a big buzzword right now, and then go through the survive phase and slash and burn mode, you have to approach survive with your growth hat on. Otherwise, you probably will not get to thrive. That's how dramatic I feel about this. Now, does that mean you don't fire people? No, you unfortunately might have to let people go, which I've talked about, and the fact you have to make tough decisions.
Right.
But that knee-jerk, let's just get as much cash in as possible, and as long as runway is not necessarily the best answer either. So get through the basics with a growth mindset, but then go on. The second move is what I call a power move, and that's repurposing or partnering. And what you do there is you look at every single asset in your company, every team, every person, every data set. If you're in the physical goods, which warehouses, trucks, cars, office space, every single asset, and ask one question: can this bring in as much value now as it did before March 2020? If not, who or what can it add value for? It's a very powerful question. Who or what can it add value for? Now, we saw national examples, right? Now, my personal favorite, Mercedes Formula One team here in the UK, they repurposed to make ventilators, right? Tito's Vodka, not too far from you guys, repurposed to make hand sanitizer. But there's cooler stuff, right? So some of the fast fashion companies here in the UK, they repurposed all their employees to one of the big grocery stores. Avis in Saudi Arabia repurposed all of their drivers and cars to a logistics center. So all of their assets were utilized. And I could go on example after example about how trucks, how warehouses, how florist shops were repurposed to hold hand sanitizer for companies who shifted to making them very quickly. That's your power move, right? If you can get through survive phase by still generating value from your assets, even at a lower amount, You don't have to shed everything that your competitors are. And when things go back up, you are ready to roll.
So this is really pointing back to making sure that you stay oriented around providing value.
Yes.
So looking at
that anchor. Yeah. And if you keep that value creation anchor, right, through all of these steps, you'll start seeing kind of that common thing as we go throughout.
Yeah, because what was interesting about this particular Black Swan event is that the demand didn't evaporate, it just changed. And so who was able to provide demand radically changed between January and April? So could you repurpose to meet the new demand? That's the question.
Exactly. That's what I mentioned, florist shops, right? Well, if florist shops aren't working, you're making hand sanitizer, can't take credit card machines. Guess what? You can store your hand sanitizer in all your local florist shops. And guess what? They also know how to take credit cards, which you don't, because you've only sold to customers who don't do credit cards. So there's examples I could give you in every single industry, but it's that notion, to go back to Eva's point, value creation lens first as you go through everything. Now, and I want to go back to the first point. And I found, Will, that, it was actually the VCs, it was the board members who got stuck here. They had their playbook. They knew what you had to do. And I never would have predicted, again, I don't get in the business of predicting the future, that it was boards who would stay and survive longer than executive teams. But that's what I saw, was that the boards were actually keeping their companies back because they had a playbook that worked in '08. But this is a different downturn, right? There's many more repurposing and partnering options now. There's many other ways to kind of create value. And so if you let yourself get stuck, right, you probably lost months against others who are moving ahead a lot faster. The stuff that seems obvious, like customer communication and employee engagement, like it's not something I talk a lot about as someone who does high growth strategy, but it became strategic. And I think it's still important to talk about it even in November, because companies are getting really lazy here, like really lazy, right? And I'm hearing things on executive teams like, oh, everybody's used to it now. Like it's just become normal for everybody. And yeah, I see, Will, your face. No, like there's nothing about this is normal, right?
I go through waves, like I think I'm okay with it, and then I'll hit 2 or 3 weeks where I'm like, good God, how long is this going to go on? So you have to talk to your employees and make sure they're there.
And don't get lazy, right?
Yeah, especially if you're shifting, like you were talking about, Rebecca, shifting from maybe being in survive to reset back to survive. So number one, like one of the biggest mistakes is being delusional about where you are. But the second is, if the last communication was thriving and you've shifted a couple of times, then that disconnect, like just undermines the entire employee infrastructure.
So much so. And that it feels so simple, Eva, but that's actually one of the biggest feedbacks I got from CEOs was the framework that helped the most initially, because they could put this up and say, we're in survive mode, but don't worry, we're going to go through reset and here's what we're going to do. And we're going to be one of those thrive companies. And that common language that employees were able to talk about, and the board was using the same language as the exec team, as kind of the employees on the line, they were able to, because it's so simple, right? And the words make sense. And they were able to identify with the different phases. And that, common language is very important, right? Yeah. And that actually, the simplicity actually became the power of, I think, some of the impact that it led to.
Yeah, just to add stability. And it's like, we know where we are. We're not being ridiculous. Exactly. We're calling it. And we have a plan where we are. It may suck, plan is, this.
Yeah. And that actually relates me to a related point about this is I've labeled it false air cover. And so there's one thing about getting lazy and saying, hey, this is normal. But the other thing that I saw was just frustrating was executives would say, there's too much on the team's plate. We can't go through the reset yet. We can't do strategy. Everybody's just so bogged down. And I would just find myself saying, like, how dare you, right? How dare you think that your team is so bogged down, your senior executive team, that after a couple months of survive, believe me, I think they're yearning, right, to go through this process and to start resetting. And I found a lot of executives giving what I call false air cover, again, repeating, and just saying, hey, like, I can't ask them to do anything else right now. And I'm more like, well, let's figure out what they're doing and take a lot of that off their plate so we can free up some mind share so they can go on and get to this next step with you. And then I think the learning point, and, Will, you and I talk about this all the time. This was my other key learning out of this, is that if you use survive to bump up your learning velocity rather than turn the tap off, you're already almost into thrive, or at least you're in the first cycle of thrive, right? That we know this, right? Companies that learn faster grow faster. It's the simplest thing there is about a high growth strategy. You learn faster, you grow faster. In a company that were doing the postmortems, they were doing the pre-mornings. They added the agenda point into their weekly huddle. Like, not what do we do, what are we going to do, but also what do we learn this week? What do we need to learn next week? Those were the companies that accelerated the fastest. I know it seems simplistic to say, oh, the companies that learn faster grew faster. It happens all the time. It really happened during this phase. And I think if you're a smaller company, this is immense competitive advantage right now because the bigger guys turn the learning tap off. They're not testing assumptions. They're not experimenting. They're not kind of doing those things. So if you're a smaller company, established space, and you can keep that learning curve steep right now, I mean, I guarantee you're going to get ahead if you've got the other components in place.
What I love about this slide is like this keep learning, the four bullet points before really point, here's what to learn about.
Yeah.
You know, we need to learn about the basics. We need to continually be learning about that.
Yeah.
Continually asking, how can we create the value? Continually asking, is our customer communication good enough?
Yeah, and what are customers telling us, right? What are customers telling us, right? You know, your customers are those no's that are coming in. Are you switching from trying to sell to trying to learn from your customers? Because, hey, they're trying to figure this out too, right? And that's, again, where I found to be the power.
Are there, like, you know, I see the four bullet points above, nice roadmap, but are there other areas that you think you see are essential for companies in this right now to learn from?
Yeah, and it's a big part of the reset. And the sentence that I just found myself saying over and over again is, if X, then Y. Like, if we believe X, then Y, then what do we need to do? Because this process of the transition from survive to reset is understanding all of those fundamental assumptions that your company, but more so for these guys, your industry is based on. Because a lot of them that we thought we had 10 years on got challenged in 2 months, right? Some of them in 2 weeks. So that fundamental curiosity of saying, if X, then Y. If we believe this to be true going forward, then what would we do? And we used to believe this, but we know that's not true anymore. But because we believe that we were doing this, what should we be doing instead? So this phrase that always scares me the most, but really scares me now, is when any team tells me, oh, well, we're just head down execution mode. And I just want to say, are you crazy? Like, get your head up, right? That is the worst thing you can be in 2020 is head down execution mode. And people come to meetings with a sense of pride, right? Like, oh, I know I've just been like really head down execution this week. And I'm saying that's actually probably, I don't want you to be in that phase, right? You know, accountable and meeting your metrics, of course, if the situation hasn't changed. But I'm much more interested in you trying to figure out if the situation's changed. And maybe the last point on survive, and then we can chat a little bit about reset, is it does involve the tough choices, right? And I don't know, and I'd love to hear from the two of you what you saw some of the best examples are, but I really think Brian Chesky at Airbnb wrote the playbook on this. And that will probably be the case study that we will back in the next downturn and the downturn after that to say, hey, what big kind of unicorn kind of pre-IPO company did this the best? Maybe not the best, but the way that they just really refocused their business, right size, and let people go with just such empathy and transparency. I just really feel, again, that was probably the playbook for what other companies should look forward to doing this part right.
We had a survive moment with Critical Watch, and it was at Christmas, or was it Christmas or Thanksgiving, where we had to sit down and go through what are the tough choices, Eva? I mean, what do you?
Yeah, we avoided impacting the holidays for the team, but it became really. So the key things that were important was to really just honor the dignity of everybody there. Like, it wasn't about them; it was about where we were as a company. Mm-hmm. And then it was also, once we realized that that's where we were going, like, it may feel like better to wait. It's not. It's better. It's better to do it earlier, so you can actually transfer like the wages you would have paid by waiting into them and help them find the next. The next message.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I found held companies back was like sunk cost fallacy, right? And we all know what it is, but man, does it get in the way when you have to make those tough choices, right? So for those who don't know, sunk cost is something that you've done in the past. It's time that you spend, or that's money that you spent, and you can't get it back no matter what you do. So by definition, sunk, gone. But what you'll hear happen in meetings, they'll say, we can't cut that project, right? We already spent $100,000 there. Or, we can't get out of that, right? We've already spent 6 months on that or 3 months on that. It's like, well, by definition, that's gone, right? There's nothing we can do in the future to get that time or money back. So the question should never be how much time or money did we spend? It's knowing what we know today, would we invest in that or would we do that? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is no, and I would argue maybe you pause it, if not cut it, right? Because we need to just be razor focused on what are the things we know we should be doing now, given the change situation. And the phrase that I use a lot coming from this to reset is the no regret move, right? What's the move that we could take right now that even if the situation changed, we wouldn't regret doing this? And just kind of returning to with your management team, are there any obvious no regret moves this week or this month? Like, what are some things that even if the situation changed, we'd be comfortable that we made the right choice there? Those are really your secondhand playbook that we should move forward with during this phase. So that's the survive phase. But again, I want to transition people out of that and get into the reset. And, reset does mean reset. And reset's hard for everybody. Like, reset's hard if your company's 3 months old. Reset's hard if your company's 3 years old. Reset's hard if your company's 30 years old, right? Because there's this notion of, I don't want to start over, right? Or do we really have to do that work again? Or just this notion of like, well, it was kind of working before, so maybe we should just wait it out. And reset also doesn't mean change, right? Reset means revisit and look at again. And the notion is you challenge every single assumption that your company was based on and your industry was based on, and each and every one say, is this assumption still true? If not, what should we be doing instead? And probably the impactful step you need to do on this is understand your beliefs. And Will and Eva, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think one of the myths of high growth companies is that their metrics are their playbook, right? And my notion is during extreme uncertainty, know what your playbook is. It's your beliefs. What are those 4 or 5 beliefs you have about the industry and the market and your company's right to play? And that actually becomes your playbook of testing and iterating against those beliefs and trying to confirm or disconfirm them, right? And so one of the most important steps you do in the reset is look at both the macro trends, political, economic, regulatory, et cetera, and also your own company and say, what are the major trends that have impacted this? And what do we believe to be true going forward? And articulating your company's beliefs. You're not predicting because you can't, but you're saying, here's a stance that we're going to take. And we're going to start testing as quickly as possible these beliefs because these beliefs are going to inform our choices going forward. So that notion that you start with the beliefs rather than getting out a blank sheet of paper and saying, what should we be doing instead? The priorities can wait. You've got to get alignment between your team. And if you have a board with your board on your beliefs first.
Well, it's a huge thing because a pandemic like we've gone through, things have really changed. So what did I believe before that if I were to start new today, I would say, no, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
Because, my partner that founded One and Only with me, he bought into a theater chain.
Yeah.
And he and I have been having this conversation. What do you believe? Do you believe that people will go back to theaters when this is over? Or do you, so we've been talking through, well, we think so. And if you think so, then you can't just abandon the business. You've got to position yourself to take over from the people who have retreated while we're going through this.
Yeah. But you've got to put that belief on a piece of paper and say, hey, we're only going forward with this because we believe at least 60%, at least 50%, at least 40% of people will return to going to the movies at least once a week, once a month, right? Yes. And you're watching that along the way. And when you feel that belief has been fundamentally challenged, that's when you go, right? And the frames become so powerful that's why I say put them on a paper, rank them in order of criticality, and make sure you're constantly watching out and testing those most critical ones, right? That notion that you taught me years ago, what has to be true for this to be a great idea? That's your power question during the step. What has to be true for this to be a great idea?
The weird thing about this is I feel like it's been mostly an accelerant for things that were already happening. Like people started doing things over the internet in 95. It's amazing how little we still do over the internet, even though it dominates everything.
Yeah.
And this just took us 10 years into the future.
Yeah.
And so, if you were a company in denial about that the internet was still going to impact your business, this is probably really shaking your world up.
Oh, yeah. So what strikes me about this reset is the amount of courage it takes to honestly step into reset. Because it's right now, everything is uncertain. And if you honestly step into reset, you're adding more uncertainty. You're letting go of everything of knowing what you knew before and now adding more questions to it, which is needed, right? But it's internally, on the internal landscape, it's good to have the management team step in, really truly set aside ego, really relook at everything I think it is an act of courage with metrics. One is that whenever a team puts metrics in place, people start to manage the metrics because they want the numbers to look good, right? And so unless you hold what the purpose of the metrics were to begin with as in the forefront, then the metrics actually start to run the shop, which is counterproductive. You want the why they're in place to run it, which is what, to me, when I hear you say, be explicit about the assumptions that they're validating, like that's how I connect the dots.
That is such a powerful way of putting it, Eva, that, it takes courage to go through that step because everything around us is uncertain. And we're going to say, well, let's actually plop up on the wall the stuff that we actually felt good about, right, coming into this year and question that too. But on the other hand, I say, there aren't actually that many times in your career you get to do it, right? If any of you have worked at an established company, you'll have these management offsites and these retreats, and you'll go away and kind of reimagine the future and say, what if the industry looked like this? And we do these things, right? And then we try to get one or two of those retreat insights back into the company, right? And we just got an opportunity to say, hey, let's challenge everything. And by the way, your team wants you to challenge everything. And it's an environment where we can challenge everything. So why would you throw it away, right? When you have this opportunity to actually do that in an environment where it's welcoming. So it takes courage, but also wasting it, I think, is a waste to not go through a reset when you get handed a chance. But I want to pick up on something that Will said is that I think that's one of the powerful things that we're seeing is that COVID is much more of an accelerant than a creator. Now, I think there's a handful of what I call mega trends that we are seeing, right? On-prem to off-prem, kind of globalization to nationalism, kind of efficiency to robustness are what I call three of the big mega trends that are a bit more created or shifted a different way in 2020. But if you look at the other ones, digitization, et cetera, those were on their way. We just thought we had more time and that time just collapsed, right? That became an exponential curve of how quickly that accelerated. I think let's talk about metrics, right? Because I think the other thing in the reset is pulling back and knowing whether or not you need tight metrics. And I liken it to you have to make a choice as a company. Do we need a destination or a direction? When you're in that growth mode, it's very tempting to kind of just manage a destination. By the end of 2020, we're going to be a $10 million company. By the end of 2021, we're going to be a $30 million company. And if you've got these traction points, you've got these margins that are associated with it, you've got these metrics. And you're saying kind of that time, that date, we were going to look like that. Now, if you're going for an exit or an IPO or any sort of shareholder event, like destinations are very helpful, right? But if you're facing extreme uncertainty, destinations will just get in the way, right? Because you're going to be heading straight in the wrong place. So I liken it to the difference between something like we've got to take exit 405 for Santa Monica and we've got to go northwest, right? Know when you need to get your compass out versus the GPS. And there's times when you need the GPS and there's also times where the compass is okay because you're telling the company, hey, we have a pathway. I know where we're going. It's just like, but it's northwest. I don't know if it's Santa Monica. And why I like that example is think 1850s, right? If the explorers had headed for Santa Monica, they would have missed the goal. The goal was farther northwest. So back to the courage point, it's okay to put your company on a direction versus a destination, but at least you're giving the team the alignment that they want right now because they want their leadership to show them that they've at least got a plan out of it.
Yeah, and they want to know that you're looking at something and they can engage.
Yes. Yeah. You set the direction on the compass and you set the pace, but you're checking in along the way. And as you go, you're probably refining and getting tighter about that. And maybe you can actually put that destination in. But right now, most companies, most industries just need a direction, and that's okay, but you need a pathway. And maybe the last thing that I want to talk about the reset, on the thrive, on the reset is this notion of boundaries. And boundaries are actually very powerful things when you're trying to execute quickly. And people often give me a wrinkled nose when I say you need boundaries if you want to move fast, because they say, well, don't boundaries constrain my team? Like, why would I put like a constraint around my team?
But by definition, you're constrained by the universe. So I find that whole thing just kind of odd. We're all constrained.
We're all constrained, right? But more so, right? Like boundaries give your team freedom. And what I mean by that is if you don't give your team their boundaries, they're also, hopefully you didn't hire idiots, right? And if you've got a boss, you probably know there's a boundary somewhere. And during a time of uncertainty, I'm not going to run around looking for my boundaries. It's kind of like playing an unmarked minefield. Like they're somewhere. Am I going to go dancing around trying to find them? Probably not, right? So your team's going to stay like right here and ask you for permission for absolutely everything that they do, which is not a way to grow out of the downturn. So you actually need to give your team boundaries and say, here's our intent. Here's what we're trying to achieve. But in achieving that, you've got to stay within these boundaries. And, this language a lot came from Helmut von Moltke, the Prussian military general. And I always anchor it by, we have to be across the river by noon on Monday, but only march at night and keep half your supplies with you. Then I, as a general, I'm going to step back and trust my troops to make that intent happen within those boundaries. Like, we know we can't micromanage a war, right? So why are we trying to micromanage our team when they're trying to grow out of this uncertainty? So the intersection between reset and thrive is actually my favorite learning point. And Will, you know this about me. I'm pretty obsessed with accelerating learning because I liken it to playing with Legos. And I don't know, so if you've got kind of young kids and you've ever played with Legos, think when you're transitioning from reset to thrive and you're kind of putting your business back in place, you got to take it back a bit. But what Thrive companies do not do is rebuild their own business. So I want you to think of it like playing with Legos and think, and I'm going to use my hands on a call here, but I do that all day long. You're putting a Lego on top of a Lego on top of a Lego. And every time you put the next Lego on, you say, we used to do this like that because we believe this. Is that still true? I'll give you one of my favorite examples. So think about your sales team. How did you organize your small sales team? You could say, well, we organize our sales team by region because, let's say decisions were made at the plant level and our customers like to see our sales rep every couple of months. Okay. Well, are those things still true? Well, no one's seeing anybody right now, right? And in downturns, decision-making tends to centralize rather than decentralize. So it used to be a plant or office decision is probably now a region decision. It used to be region is probably a country, with country is probably all the way up to the top, right? So this regional sales force might be an incredible waste of money now. Because again, you're not seeing anyone in person and decisions aren't taken there. And that's just one example. There's hundreds. Even a company that's making $1 million is based on hundreds, if not thousands of assumptions. Look at them all, right? Think about building that building block. And this is as simple as start a Google Doc and just have columns be like decision, assumption, current assumption, and just see how many that you get, right? Here's the decision we made when we set up. Here was the assumption we had when we did it. Here's our current assumption. And just watch those things pile up like Lego blocks. And it's really good, right, for the management team to look at those on a week-by-week basis because you don't want to rebuild that old business, right, because the situation might have changed. And the other thing that I'm seeing now is don't be afraid to do non-scalable things in the transition between reset and thrive. There is, and I know, and Will, again, we've talked about this a lot in the past, there's this real premature worry about scalability. And you'll hear feedback, well, even if that worked, right, that's not scalable. Don't care. Just do it. If you can figure out how to create value, smart people like you two will help them figure out how to scale it, right? Their job is to figure out how to create value. So don't be afraid to do activities that are not scalable. Sort value creation coming out of the downturn. People will figure out how to scale it. So I think that's the power. It's like you can't get lazy between reset and thrive, right? There's a transition phase between those two. And I'll go back to the sentence I say hundreds of times a day. If X, then Y. If we believe this, then Y. Then what do we have to do? So the transition, again, that's your high learning moment. And you've got to make sure you're taking use of it and track these things somewhere. Because you want to have those assumptions tracked somewhere. Because the next time you hit a downturn, you're ready to go for the reset a lot faster than you went through this one. And let me talk about the punchline of thrive. And then let's kind of just dig into anything else that you might want to. I think it's this simple, guys. So I call the whole principle of survive, reset, thrive, discipline, flexibility. And by that, I mean, I think there's a lot of mythology around growing out of a downturn that you just kind of wandered into it, or you kind of got lucky, or you just kind of were chasing opportunities. It's a pretty disciplined process, right? And, Will, you'll know this from your days of doing this. It's very analytical. It's tracking the metrics. It's kind of putting these things together. It's building that rhythm. But when you spot something, you got to move. Right? So if you can marry the discipline of testing the beliefs, testing the assumptions, building your Lego blocks, like reassessing these things, and then move when you got something, that's the power. And then I've got the recipe up there. So I'm going to share the recipe with all of your viewers. And it's 3 things. You want to be a Thrive company. You need a strong balance sheet, strategic insight, and operational agility. And you say that's too simple, but I think it is that simple. Your strong balance sheet you kept through the survive phase, the insights you grabbed in the reset phase, and then you grab them with agility in the thrive phase. If you can put those 3 things together, like you will be a Thrive company. It's just hard to do, which is why we don't see as many examples of them as the ones that don't. So that's survive, reset, thrive. And let's hear what else you want to dig into.
Well, it's interesting because it's hard to to teach people sometimes how to have strategic insights. And so I've been learning from you. You've directed me to read some books, and I've just been thinking about it. I will recommend one thing to our listeners. If you want to see what real interesting strategic insights look like, go watch Elon Musk's Battery Day this year. And it is amazing how he goes through and he looks for the breakthrough victory that he can accomplish and then stacks them together in a way that makes a company that's got a strong balance sheet. They have strategic insights, and yet they're changing based on when those insights change, what the focus should be.
In some ways, Elon Musk just does this cycle in such a fast iteration, you don't know it's a cycle, right? I mean, all of those companies are just going through this, I almost said hyperloop with no intention, right? Just going through this hyperloop of survive, reset, thrive, right? He is constantly challenging assumptions, identifying the insights, grabbing with agility, getting it over there, and then starting again with something else.
So how would you recommend people that are starting their journey out to learn about how to look for strategic insights? Because everyone hears that term. I know I was fuzzy on what it meant. I realize now it's methodical thinking. It's kind of engineering thinking about certain things. But what's a good way to get better at it, Rebecca?
So a couple ways. I go back to your beliefs, right? I think the beliefs are probably the most powerful way to do it. So what I've built for all the companies I'm working with is called a belief tracker. And we've identified the top trends, again, both macro. And then what I like to do is map out your value chain. So if you're just getting started, what I recommend you do is map out your industry's value chain. If you don't know what a value chain is, you got to learn this one, right? It's an old tool we've got to bring back to get through this phase. So your value chain is a series of interconnected activities that allow a company or industry to create value. So this series of interconnected activities that allow you to create value. So you map out your industry value chain. And then every step of the value chain, how R&D is done, how supply chain is done, how ops are done, how go-to-market is done, how marketing is done, how customer service is done, and say, how has this been impacted in 2020? Like, what assumptions about this step of the value chain were challenged, and what do we believe to be true going forward? And map out every step, and think about the macro ones, and then think about which of these beliefs are high impact and high criticality. So that process, right? And then, again, you're going through, then if we believe this, I'm going to repeat now, if we believe this, then kind of what would we have to believe? If we believe this, then what would we do? And start learning which of those insights that you need to test and trying to break them down. So I know I'm making it sound complicated. Go back to value chain, write down trends, from the trends, write out the if X then Y, start testing those things. And you can do this as simply as tracking an Excel sheet, right? And then you're just kind of building in this constant way of testing these different things.
So one thing that I noticed in Elon's talk that was an aha for me about his value chain was his decision to sell cars directly and not through dealerships, and how that changed the cash flow of building a car to where he got the money up front and could deliver the car before he had to pay his suppliers, which means that every car he sells improves his cash flow versus every car he sells increases the amount of money he has to raise so he can finance it. And so that, he was just going through the value chain of, I'm going to build a car and how do I get it to the customer? Now, what are the activities everyone else is doing and what can I change that would give me an advantage that they can't do? So anyway, it's just
you're looking for those assumptions that are so ingrained in the industry, they have become dogma, right? And everyone else in the industry forgot that it's not a fact. It's just an assumption. Cars are sold through dealerships. Americans need to own cars. American families need to own 2 cars. These are not facts, right? They've just been built into our psyche because we've seen the industry kind of grow up around them. But if you have the discipline to do that, the other way related is then just grab a P&L statement or an income statement from a company in your industry and go through every line item and say, what would happen if this line item was 0? What would happen if this line item was 10x, 20x? And Will, you and I have done this with many companies. And it's fascinating because you think, well, hold on, this actually could go to 0, with technology X. And now technology X is mainstream. So what if I just did that? So value chain, balance sheet, income statement, go through line by line and ask the question again, what assumptions is based on? And what would happen if this fundamentally changed? What technology or social change has happened in 2020 that is now allowing this to change? And the other one's quite simple. You just think about your customers, the typical customers in the industry, who uses, who buys, who influences. Downturns tend to disrupt one of those customer groups more so than others. Now, in cars, it's obviously the dealership. In retail, it's the grocery store or the retail store, right? It's getting cut out of the chain. But just trying to map out who got hit, within the value chain, within the balance sheet, kind of within the customer circles. And that's probably one way. And then just start getting really good at this and do it for fun, right? I know it sounds like not a great way to have fun, but kind of you hear an industry on the news, say, okay, I wonder what their value chain is like. Map out the value chain, start going through it. Now, it's probably advice more for people who are looking for something to do than those who are already in one, but that's how I would start.
What I'd love to dive into a little bit more is around operational agility.
Yeah.
And I love the analogy you used with the constraints and the importance of that and more. One of the ways that I've thought about it is through the theory of constraints.
Yeah.
Where it becomes really important to look at the bottleneck that is down the whole system. I know that a lot of people have a tendency to want to go ahead and solve for scaling when you're not at scaling because it's further down. It's the fun one. What have you learned about it, and what insights would you offer to people starting out?
Yeah, let me say two things. If this is going to sound boring, right? Just like the theory of constraints. I think that's sexy. You think it's sexy, right? Some of our listeners might not think this is a sexy topic, so bear with us. Is map out kind of that process flow, right? Because we spend too much time kind of at the very end of the funnel or kind of the marketing aspect, and you're mapping it out and you're kind of identifying kind of what's working, what's not working, where are the bottlenecks. I have never in my career seen a situation that the problem we were trying to solve didn't happen 3 steps earlier in the chain. So mapping it out on a wall, kind of it starts here, everywhere from I talked to a customer for the first time to a happy lifetime customer referring me. What are all those big chunks of activity? Where are the possible bottlenecks? Because the problem is likely way earlier in the system. Also, your competitive advantage might get trapped too, right? Just like bottlenecks can get trapped, you might be really good at something earlier, but because you stink at something later, we never get to find out about it either, right? So it works both ways.
Do you have a concrete example of like that misstep, where somebody was solving for the wrong thing too early?
So yes. So a company I was working with made home theaters, kind of home entertainment system, right? And thought the problem was around kind of the engineers and kind of like the putting together kind of the final designs and kind of the key account customers never got the right engineering time, and they were making these very complicated formulas for kind of how, like, which engineering hours went to what. You've managed teams of engineers. Like, can you imagine trying to get them to kind of work on these color-coded kind of weekly Gantt charts, map out the process flow? You know what the problem was that engineers were spending 60% of their time doing like the really quick proposals for bids we would never win, right? So if you just say, well, actually, proposals take 2 days, right? The final designs take weeks. But if you do 2 proposals a week, that's kind of your week, right? And then you can barely get started on the other ones. So removing that bottleneck and saying you can only work on a proposal if the customer has these 4 characteristics, everything else got to move through, right? No Gantt charts, no complicated Excel, it's just 5 sets of rules. If the customer doesn't look like this, don't work on the proposal, right? Those things kind of go into this thing.
So an example in the Elon Musk thing was on making a cathode. They had this huge factory to turn the raw material or turn the metal into a cathode. 70% of the plant was taking out a chemical that the guy who mined the ore put in there. And so they just went back and said, well, what if the guy pulling the ore out didn't put that chemical in there? 70% of the plant disappears, and all of a sudden they can start getting things through faster, expanding the plant faster. So you just have to really look at the whole process and why. Why are we doing this?
And I was just going to go back to that, is that I think we'd always love to think that we're reinventing everything, right? Every time we come out with a new framework. The lean 5 whys, which they of course borrowed from somebody else before that, do get you down to a lot of this too. Like, well, why do we do that? Well, why do we assume that? Well, why does it happen like that? And if you have the patience and the discipline to get to the 5th why, you've probably uncovered a root assumption that needs to be challenged.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, this is fabulous.
And we'll be coming back with probably follow-ups. What you and I tend to do is the things that we find the most interesting, we'll start researching material on it. I think strategy is just fascinating and personally.
Well, I do too, but of course I'm a little bit biased on that. But excellent. Thanks, guys. It was lovely to talk to you guys today and hope it's helpful for some of your regular listeners.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.